The Three Little Pigs, The Lord of the Rings, Goldilocks, and the Three Bears. There is power in storytelling with the number 3. That is reflective in our parable today. In the rule of 3, it is with the failure of the first and second that the third comes along and changes the result. It was not successful to build a house of straw or sticks. It was successful, though, to build a house of bricks and stump the wolf. It took until the third book or movie for the hobbits Frodo and Sam to destroy the ring and for Aragorn to become the rightful king of Gondor. It was not the first try for Goldilocks nor the second, but it was the third test to find the best chair, porridge, and bed. Likewise, it was in the third character in this parable that the right and just ending unfolded. The last character in today's parable is misleading, though. You see, the grouping should have been priest, Levite, and Israelite. For those that were Jewish, that would have been the natural, easy, no-brainer response. That's the grouping that makes sense. They belong to each other. They belong together. The grouping of priest, Levite, and Samaritan is shocking. Samaritans do not belong with priests and Levites. An Israelite should always be the third person in that grouping. Over the last 2 millennia, the parable of the Good Samaritan has been boiled down and tamed into an easy punchline of morality. A one-sentence summation, though, is the antithesis of a parable. Parables should remind, they should provoke, they should refine, confront, disturb. They should challenge listeners to see the world in a different way, and at times indict them. We have become so familiarized with this grouping of priest, Levite, and Samaritan that we have deemed the priest and the Levite as the bad guys. The Samaritan has been forever labeled as good. In fact, our society has become so conditioned to this story that we have identified laws as Good Samaritan laws to encourage people to provide assistance to those who are injured, ill, or in peril, or otherwise incapacitated. The name Samaritan is synonymous with goodness. Don't get me wrong, the actions the Samaritan exhibited were good actions. The actions the priest and the Levite demonstrated were selfish. However, it's important to dive deeper into the story to better understand the challenge Jesus gives the lawyer, the challenge Jesus gives us. There was incredible tension between the Israelites and the Samaritans. A present-day example of the hatred and animosity might be how we feel toward the name Osama bin Laden. Amy Jill Levine, in her book Short Stories by Jesus, says, to Jesus' Jewish audience, as well as to Luke's readers, the idea of a good Samaritan would make no more sense than the idea of a good rapist or a good murderer. Samaria had a bad reputation. The Samaritans were the enemy. There were hundreds of years of evidence that proved their disdain for each other. That being said, the Samaritan was not a social victim. He had money, freedom to travel, the ability to find lodging, and leverage with the innkeeper. The Samaritan was able to find a place to stay in the story, even though Jesus was denied lodging in a Samaritan town right before even telling this parable. We do not need to pity the Samaritan. He was not disenfranchised or subjugated. This story, this parable, is about the hatred between groups that have similar resources. It's about breaking a cycle of violence through action. It's about loving neighbors despite objections. It's about continual actions of mercy and compassion. A lesser-known story in 2 Chronicles found in the Old Testament which occurred somewhere between the 9th and 5th century BCE, depicts some of the violence and war that took place between Judah and Samaria, centuries before this parable that Jesus told us. Both sides had done wrong. Both sides were guilty of enacting hate. In one violent raid, 120,000 soldiers were killed, as well as the king of Judah's son and 2 of his officers. 200,000 wives, sons, and daughters were then taken to Samaria to be used as slaves. However, the officials in Samaria met the convoy on their return, and they said, "You will not bring these people here. You will return them to their land." Then the prisoners were given clothes and sandals, food and drink, and healing balm. All those who were weak were put on donkeys. Then they were taken back to their fellow Israelites in Jericho. They were shown compassion and mercy rather than continuing the cycle of violence and hate. The story of the Good Samaritan is quite similar to this account. The Samaritan offered the inverse of what the robbers and thieves had invoked. The robbers and thieves had stripped, beaten, and left the man to die. The Samaritan clothed, anointed, and promised return. We're not privy to any information about the man who was beaten. But what we do know is that the priest and the Levite had the opportunity to help, but they did not. The priest and the Levite were not bad people. They chose to focus on themselves in an unknown situation. Martin Luther King Jr. preached once, "I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me. It's possible these men were afraid." And so the first question that the priest and the Levite asked was, "If I stop to help this man, what will happen to me?" But then the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question, "If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?" To love our neighbor, we must continually act. We must repeatedly ask the question, what? What will happen if I do nothing? It is not a one and done question. It's a continual question with an ongoing response. Today's passage starts with a lawyer quoting Leviticus and Deuteronomy. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." If this is true, and this is what we believe, then God is the ground of one's being and the guide for one's life. If God is the guide for our lives, then loving neighbors through continual action is the response. The Samaritan acted with compassion and mercy towards the man on the side of the road. He then trusted the innkeeper to continue to provide for the unknown stranger. The Samaritan proved multiple times in this account that we make our neighbors. We choose who to be neighborly to. Even when we are fearful about how the response might personally affect us, to live life as Jesus has called us to live, we will love our neighbors through continual acts of compassion and mercy. The lawyer tried to trip up Jesus by asking the question, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus responded with the parable and then asked, "Which of these 3 do you think seemed to be the neighbor?" The lawyer responded, "He who showed mercy on him." The lawyer could not respond with the name Samaritan. The lawyer was filled with so much hatred and contempt. He had difficulty seeing the inclusive nature of neighbor that Jesus had described. To follow Jesus' words to go and do likewise means that there is no one outside of the definition of neighbor. There is no qualifier that can discriminate. Neighbors come in all different shapes, sizes, colors, ways of life. In a time of social distancing, we can very readily identify with the priest and Levite in this story. Protecting ourselves from the transmission of COVID-19 is a real concern. Jesus did not say, "Go and do like the priest and Levite," though. Following Jesus' command to show compassion and mercy is difficult, especially today. We must ask ourselves the same question the Samaritan asked: what will happen if I do nothing? One of our mission partners, Asheville Youth Mission, has put together a program called Mission Scholar. This year-long program, which costs money, is for high school youth. This program is a commitment into a deeper understanding of mission, the root causes of social injustices, and God's call on students' lives to address these issues. Some of our very own students are going to participate. This is one way to love our neighbors. A couple of weeks ago, we heard from Dr. Joseph Fox in our faith formation class, and the work that he is doing and the Martin Luther King Jr. Association is doing with the Buncombe Community Remembrance Project. He identified a variety of task groups that need help and assistance. They are working hard on community healing for our neighbors in Asheville through conversations about the history of economic, racial inequity, and injustice. FPCA is providing food for 12 baskets, as well as for Helpmate on a weekly basis, for those of our neighbors that are victims of domestic violence, as well as those neighbors that are experiencing homelessness. Our church is providing warm and fulfilling meals for those who are hungry. Ask yourself the question, what will happen if I do nothing? We must continue to ask ourselves this question. Friends, there are neighbors all around us. There are needs all around us. Write a letter to a neighbor who's isolated and alone. Provide a meal for a neighbor who is hungry. Learn more about injustice towards neighbors in this world. There are so many different ways to act. Jesus calls us to go and be like the Samaritan. Demonstrate compassion. Show mercy. Love neighbors with continual action. Amen.